Thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to have Payam here today from Slavs and Tatars. And I'm just saying a few words, because this is also part from it's part of the public lecture. It's part of the things that I introduced here, and it's part of the winter project of Ayat and Thiago, the Central Asian Pavilion. And it actually is also the first lecture that is really happening, because last week, unfortunately, was cancelled. I hope we can have a discussion afterwards, and also we would introduce a bit more about the connection. And I wanted to emphasize one point, that this is also special because the lecture is not a lecture like a talk, it's also as a performance format, which I'm very happy with. Because I think we do that in a compact way. And another point that I wanted to mention is the tact. A thing that I became very interested in since I came across the work of Slavs and Tatars, and it's some sort of little stage platform that we will hear a bit more about it, but I found it like an interesting image in relation to our project, because this platform is like used for conversations, discussions, taking a nap, having some tea or smoking, and it's a mix between a public space and actually that's what I mean exactly. And you can also find them in like public spaces. So I thought they were like a nice image for also our project, where we want to create different formats of discussions in relation to screenings, in relation to the Central Asian Pavilion, in relation to things that are happening in different spaces, like in here now, with all of you, and in Venice, and then in Central Asia, and yeah. So I will go to the top.
Hello. I'll use this if that's okay. Thank you, Susanna. Thank you for the invitation to for the talk and the discussion tomorrow, hopefully, as well as tomorrow. I will give a little bit of a brief background to Slavs and Tatars, because it's something that we're constantly finding ourselves. I think it helps to do so on as many occasions as possible, whether it's for ourselves, if not for the audience. Slavs and Tatars started out as a reading group, essentially between myself, my colleague Kasha Korczak, and our immediate surroundings, basically publishing or reprinting materials out of print, or translating to English, what had never been translated before, I think, and distributing amongst a kind of small group of friends, sort of like a book club, like I guess Oprah Winfrey meets Attila the Hun, or something like this. And so books and print, which is quite important for our practice. And here you have sort of 6 of the publications so far. Tonight we're going to talk about Mola Nasruddin, which is our most straightforward publication, in the sense that we didn't do much except translate and edit the book. There's not the kind of transversal reading of history that you find in 799. But in fact, I think that I joke with Kasha sometimes, saying that in a couple hundred years, if anybody remembers anything from Slavs and Tatars, they'll remember Mola Nasruddin, because we're the custodians of history, in a sense. And I think that's very important, because it's a historical document that in some ways legitimizes our practice. Because when you work on something for a while in the corner, it's important to have a moment when the outside world responds to it. And we've devoted ourselves to this region, which we define as between these 2 walls, the former Berlin Wall and Great Wall of China. And what's interesting about Roman Astronomia is that it came to us as artists in the early 20th century to translate what is arguably the most important periodical of the Muslim world of the 20th century. And I say that's interesting because we're not particularly qualified. We weren't incredible researchers. We didn't find it underneath some dusty corner of the library in Baku. It's almost shocking that a book like this wasn't available, or a publication like this wasn't available before. Because you would imagine that if we believe the common wisdom, which is that political Islam is kind of the successor narrative to communism in the same way that communism defined the 20th century. Let's say the rise of political Islam was a new challenge to Western liberal democracy. And you would imagine that somebody would have translated this 30, 40, 50 years ago. Think tanks, policymakers, historians, anybody, but not us, and sort of relatively unqualified artists in the sense that we're only qualified because we speak some of the language in the region, but we're not particularly qualified to talk about press in that region. Some of the topics that we'll talk about, and I think the kind of axes of our work is this notion of anti-modernism, polemics and poetics, and generosity and sacred hospitality. Anti-modernism, first of all, doesn't mean that we're against modernity. But we sort of borrowed this term from a very, very compelling book by a French professor at the Collège de France and Columbia University, whose name is Antoine Compagnon. Compagnon basically says that the true modernists are not those people that you imagine, like Mayametti or like Mayakovsky, who are so keen on believing the future as holding a utopian promise. But the true modernists, he says, and he traces it in 19th century literature, he says the true modernists are those people who are moving to the future but with a conflictual relationship with the past and the pre-modern age. So the way that Sartre described Baudelaire, kind of driving the future with an eye on the rearview mirror, or like Moulin Nasruddin, which is perfect, sort of always backwards on his donkey. And Moulin Nasruddin is the character here on the top right. She's a mascot of this publication. He's a 13th century sort of dervish fool, kind of precursor to Ali G, if you will. Asks very stupid questions or poses very sort of simple problematics that reveal much more complex issues. Of course, you see this trope also with Benjamin's Angel of History, who's propelled into the future but facing the past and the role of the past and present sort of combined. And interestingly enough, for us, we discovered in a trip to Madagascar, which is as far away from our region as possible, I think, that the words in Malagasy to describe the future are behind and rear. You describe the past as in front of you. So I think most Indo-European languages have a positivist approach to time, where we imagine the future is ahead of us because we think we know where we're going. We imagine the past is behind us because I guess we think it's irrelevant. So this idea of polemics and poetics, there's a lot of words for this in English, all of which are pretty pretentious. Amphibole is one of them, which sort of convey this idea of two contradictory statements in one, or phrases in one statement. Coincidentia positorum, also a Latin phrase. But for us, we're basically suckered from unlikely genealogies, bringing things together that don't seem to fit at first glance in one page, bringing two sort of mutually exclusive ideas into one page, into one voice, into one register. It's become a kind of a modus operandi for us in Slav and Tatars. High and low, sort of hot and cold. It's kind of a maximalism, if you will, of thought. We like this idea of kind of metaphysical splits. So, instead of doing splits with your legs, which I can't do, but you do it with your head. So you try to wrap your head around two seemingly contradictory ideas. And early work, I think, for us that conveys this is a piece that was from our first cycle of work called Digdiburi, and it's a phrase which most people here I'm sure are familiar with slang English or American, it says, "Dig the booty of monoglots, but marry my child a polyglot," which basically means if you want to have a one-night stand and fool around, make sure you do it with somebody who speaks one language. But if you're serious and going to settle down and have children or spend the rest of your life with a person, do so with somebody who speaks more than one language. Now in English, we don't usually use, people who use the words "dig the booty," which is sort of on the street, don't use the word monoglot and polyglot, at least not in the same sentence. It's kind of conflicting registers of language. Also, as you notice, it's transliterated, it's not translated. So you guys can all read this. Actually, don't need to speak Russian or Farsi. Dig the booty of monoglot. So it's basically the same, and this was inspired by Mohammad Nasruddin to a certain extent, because as we'll talk about the changes of the alphabet. Transliteration on top and transliterated Farsi or Persian script, Azeri Persian, Azeri script. Transliteration is this kind of trashy sibling to translation. In translation, we devote courses to, Nabokov did it, Baudelaire did it, but transliteration nobody really thinks about. And yet, if you speak Latin language, you're doing it all the time. Because I know I do. Emails are. It's a kind of stupid approximation of the language into another script. Stupid but necessary approximation of the language into another script. Another kind of coincidentia oppositorum or splits, I guess, is our not Moscow, not Mecca project. People know we don't put Marx and Mohammed together in the same breath. But for us, they represent that kind of thinkers of these two, let's say, or these thinkers' ideologies that have become these two narratives that I just mentioned, communism and politicalism. And interestingly enough, one of the figures that we studied in preparation for our Not Moscow, Not Mecca cycle of work, our current cycle of work, which looked at syncretism in Central Asia, was a gentleman named Norman Brown. Norman Brown on the left was a professor at Santa Cruz, a specialist of Blake, a Marxist professor, comparative literature of Blake, and did a very kind of crossover success with one of his books that Lionel Trillian was a big fan of, called The Love's Body, where he tried to psychoanalyze the entirety of history. Anyway, the last 10 years of Norman Brown's life, he devotes to studying the Quran. He doesn't convert. He just decides that the Quran is he basically says that until the 20th century, until the arrival of James Joyce, nobody in the West could understand the Quran because James Joyce didn't exist and Fleming didn't exist. And the Quran is a proto-modernist text, like James Joyce's work. Why? Because time, for example, in the Quran is not linear, like it is in the Old Testament and New Testament. Time is cyclical. Characters morph into each other. So Joseph becomes Hagar, Hagar becomes Jesus, Jesus becomes Muhammad, and then goes back to being Moses. Sort of like, if you remember Lost Highway, sort of character transformed, he wakes up and is another character. In the Bible, in the Old Testament, Moses remains Moses, Jesus remains Jesus. There's no confusing people, figures. And actually Norman Brown in his a very interesting book called Apocalypse and/or Metamorphosis, he writes, he calls Marxism and Islam two still revolutionary forces, two tired old horses. Neither of them doing very well, but it would be a mistake to take any comfort from their failure. The human race is at stake, and they both, Marxism and Islam, agree on one proposition. There will be one world, and there shall be none. So when you say that, many people kind of get afraid when they think of one world in a kind of totalitarian world, but actually, I think what he meant by one world is kind of an interconnected world. And so that was he was one of the figures that we looked at in advance of in preparation for the show, the succession called Not Moscow, Not Mecca, where we told the story of syncretism from through the perspective of the fruits, through the perspective of the fauna, and not the flora and not the fauna of the region. So, Mullah Nasruddin, should we jump into tonight's topic? So Mullah Nasruddin was a political satire that was published from 1906 to 1930. It ran about 8 to 12 pages, of which the cover, the back, and 2 pages inside were illustrations. And like great political satires. It sort of managed to speak truth to power, and at the same time sort of poke fun at things. So, for example, here you have the Tsarist army under Imperial Russia, sort of herding the Muslims to the mosque on Sunday because it's the day of prayer, according to the Russians. Not taking into account that, of course, it's Friday for Muslims. Or this kind of misunderstanding between East and West that you have here, the Europeans being kind of Russian on the right and the Azeri women on the left. Now, Mullah Nasruddin was, as I mentioned, was based or named after this Sufi character who's known as Mullah or Khoja or Afani, Nasruddin Afani. He's a 13th century Sufi character, kind of a wise man, come fool, kind of like a court jester type person. And you can find, interestingly enough, you can find a version of him from Croatia all the way to China. So he's almost become a transnational mascot to us as well. And parents tell stories to their children with Mullah Nasruddin, sort of allegories, in a similar way, I guess, that La Fontaine's fables of brothers women are told, where there's obviously sort of allegories and ethics embedded in these seemingly simple stories. A typical Mullah Nasruddin story is, for example, when there's a man on one side of the river yelling to Mullah Nasruddin, how do I get to the other side of the river? And he says, you are on the other side of the river. So it's kind of very, very first degree humor. But behind this first degree humor, there's quite a lot hidden or to unravel, whether it's perspective in this case or relativism or others. Now, a little bit about the region where the magazine is published. The Caucasus, we call it a kind of case study of complexity. The Caucasus is a region that has over 50 different languages spoken in a relatively small area. And it was the site of the great game in the 19th century between Russia and England. And today there's maybe a greater game going on there, since we hear less about it. In the 19th century, the great game, the Caucasus in Central Asia, was really what today the Middle East is in terms of mediatized region. It was kind of the hot spot of geopolitical intrigue and forces. Today, the region is still being sort of speculated by many people outside the region, outside the forces. Just this time, it's Turkey, Russia, United States, China, and even Iran. It's a far more complex game that's being played there than it was in the late 19th century. The Russians used to call the Caucasus the warm Siberia. Why? Because it was a place they would send troublemaking people far away from centers of power. So far away from St. Petersburg and Moscow. That's why you had Lermontov there. That's why you had another quite favorite writer of ours, who was kind of who wrote this equivalent of kind of Moliere play in manners called Woe from Wit, about Moscow manners, a satire of Moscow. So Mullah Nasruddin was a political satire like you find in many countries today, I guess, sort of Private Eye in the UK or Canal Enchaîné in France. I was surprised to see that Mad Magazine still exists. The magazine branch out, but it still goes on. I don't know who's actually reading it. And I think probably a good predecessor or a good kind of precursor to Mullah Nasruddin was actually the anarchist journal called L'Essai de L'Heure, and especially the role of illustration that was played by the role of illustration played in these magazines, in this publication. The people who were kind of important illustrators of these publications, L'Essai de L'Heure was a Czech fellow named František Kupka and Jules Angeon, amongst others. The Soviets, despite, let's say, a lack of freedom of press that we know about, they had a strong tradition of satire throughout the communism, in the form of two important articles called Crocodile, and Little Fire. Now, Mullah Nasruddin was very progressive as a publication. It was very much of its time. It railed against sort of corruption of the elites. It was anti-colonialist. It wasn't in any way Bolshevik or even communist, but it was definitely on the side of the downtrodden and the poor. And here you can see an example of that, the landlords beating the peasants who were essentially being used as donkeys or beasts of burden. And on the right, this is a satire of Muhammad Ali Shah, who was one of the last Qajar Shahs in Iran, who escaped to the Crimea, to Ukraine, or Russia at the time, when he was thrown out of the country. And he said that basically that Iranian women didn't appreciate him as much as the Ukrainian women did. He was a little bit of a gigolo. He was dressed up as kind of a woman's man. And it had a very clear agenda of Mullah Nasruddin, sort of media as advocacy. Mullah Nasruddin managed to do then what people only dream of doing today, which is speaking to both the elite and the masses, as we were talking about earlier. And here we have a perfect example of this anti-colonialist illustrations. The lion is the UK, or England, sorry, at the time, with the Iranian hat, sort of bird, because the England's role in Iran, and the tiger of Germany with the fez on top. In the back you have Morocco being sort of devoured by Europe, and the bull on the right, and France is often depicted as foxes. Now, Mullah Nasruddin was read from Morocco all the way to India, and in particular it was read just across the border in Iran, so just across the border in the Caucasus, and it was in fact largely because of the illustrations that it was able to be read in so many different countries, because of course you couldn't expect people in Egypt or in Morocco or Iran to understand Azeri and Turkish. Now, a little bit about the region, a little bit more about the region, just to give some images of it. And this is the building that the Ministry of Transport had the last time we were there, was doing an exhibition and a series of talks inside this. This Ministry of Transport is from 1974, I think, but it's been highly influential for current architects. If you recall, if you're familiar with Herzog and Leon's Vitra, he's in Germany, outside Switzerland. It's based on this it's inspired by this stacked containers. And Kohlhaas has a project in Singapore, a residential project, which also sort of takes this form of architecture. Baku is where the magazine moved after a brief stint in northern Iran. And Baku is a place that we get very excited about places like Baku, I guess, in a similar way that other people get excited, I guess, about things like Justin Bieber. But Baku is not as obscure as some people would imagine. It was the site of it was the place that produced half of the world's oil until the Second World War, and in fact a good portion of people's fortunes, big families' fortunes, like the Nobels and the Rothschilds, comes from Baku oil, and until oil was discovered in the Gulf. And again, just another example of architecture. Just to give you a sense of scale, that's a Mercedes from the bottom left. And this is the Dom Sovietov, which is I guess kind of a house of its closest thing to I guess would be a city hall. And this kind of mix of Ottoman neoclassical and Stalinist architecture, the scale, is something you only really find in the post-Soviet sphere. Now, often magazines, at least until recently, magazines have really defined a decade or a city, and I'm not sure if that's going to continue with the arrival of digital media, but at least in our generation, there's been quite important magazines and these sort of cultural moments that they defined or championed. And I think that you can just decide some, of course, colors in the 80s is very important as cultural publication, at least writing on the zeitgeist. In the same way that in the 90s, this idea of Cool Britannia was defined by magazines like The Face or Davies or others. And things like amateur photography, which was never used commercially like it's used today for selling, for marketing, like you find all over fashion. That was heralded by magazines like Purple in the 90s, and this past decade really belonged to Berlin. And I think it was not a coincidence that the importance of a magazine like 0322C in this past decade. Well, that's really defined its time period, of early sort of decades of the 20th century, and definitely that whole region, more than just a city. And like the best things in life, it came in sort of twos. If you music from cinema, we have sort of duos, like John and Paul and Robert and Al. We had a little bit less known figures called Jalil Mahmoud-Zadeh and Alexander Sabir. Mahmoud-Zadeh was the editor-in-chief of Nasruddin. He was a really tireless champion of the poor, secular, anti-colonialist. His counterpart, his kind of colleague, partner in crime, was a man named Alexander Sabir, who's almost like, I don't know if you're familiar with this pamphleteer journalist called H.L. Mencken, who was a very kind of biting satirist of the early 20th century American journalist. And Sabir was so hounded by his because of his criticism that he had to work on 50 different pseudonyms, of which is my favorite one is the one called Hop, which means patience. And he, on his deathbed, he even said, "I laid my flesh down for my people, but if God would give me more time, I would lay my bones down too." And sort of come to the last moment. It's almost left up there with that famous Oscar Wilde parting phrase of, it's either me or the wallpaper. And it's another kind of important figure for Nasruddin is a gentleman named Mirza Fatali Ahuda, who advocated Latinizing the Azeri alphabet. And his reason for Latinizing, other than what they believe would be modernizing the culture through the alphabet, politics of alphabets, but he believed that Arab script wasn't sufficient in terms of being able to express the different vowels of Azeri. Azeri has 9 vowels, and the Arabic script has 5? 4 or 5? Off the top of my head. And so for today, we'll just focus on 3 chapters. We essentially combed through those first volumes that I showed you in hardback. We reissued one last year. We chose out of, let's say, 3,000 or so illustrations, we chose the 250 or so most relevant, that we thought were most relevant for a global audience, international audience. And so we put them into chapters. These chapters didn't exist. The first one being women, the second one being East versus West, and the third one being Iran. Now, I would say that the majority of illustrations of Nasruddin, if were dedicated to this role of women, or to champion the rights of women, or equality of women. It really is doubles, in many ways, he's a perspective through which to see other things, for example, modernization, education, or even a double standard, gender equality, a double standard that Azeri men had to European women and to Muslim women. So here, for example, 2 women are looking at a prison and they're saying, look how lucky they are, they have windows to prison. Their own houses, they didn't have windows. Over here on the left, you have respect being paid to the bride, and a month later, sort of no sign of that respect. One of my favorite ones is on the right. If you recall, 1906, this is sort of really the beginning. So 1906 is 1 year after Japan humiliated Russia in a war in 1905. And it came as a shock not only to Russia, but to most of the world, because a small island nation, Navy fleet, basically decimated the country that covered 1/6 of the world's landmass. And so Japan was known to be was held up as a symbol of progress, almost like it was in the 80s, with the technology that we gave to Japan. But at the time, it was really kind of a symbol of progress and modernity. And here you have Abdul Rashid or Mullah saying to Japanese women, no matter how much progress you made, as long as your face isn't covered, basically it's not worth. You're not as good as the other women. And you see the ripple effect of what happened when sort of due to this gender inequality. The relationship between child and mother is reversed. So the child blackmails the mother, saying, "If you don't give me a piece of candy, I'll tell Poppy to look out the window." Or the Turks, who were so keen on a constitutional revolution up on top, as soon as they realized it gives women the right to gather and to protest and to vote, they sort of said, no, we don't need this kind of revolution. Let's go back to the way it was. Now, the picture is much more complex than that, because, interestingly enough, Azerbaijan gave women the right to vote before the United States or the UK in 1918. I'm not sure when Norway women had the right to vote, but I bet it's probably later than 1918.
No.
1913.
Okay.
Second.
Second in Europe.
Finland first, New Zealand.
So, yeah, and I think Switzerland was like in the 60s, right?
Sorry?
Switzerland, I think, was in 1961 or something.
France in 46.
Yeah. So it's not this picture of course, of Muslim countries which are unilaterally or monolithically anti-women is obviously more complex than it comes across. The magazine itself used Jews and Armenians as Christians as counterpoints. So whenever it refers to Muslims, what it means is Azeris. And the reason why is that it was understood in the Caucasus that basically Muslims in the Caucasus, not necessarily all Azeris, because of course we've got Islamists and Chechens, but it shows that basically Azerbaijanism as a self-identity didn't really exist at that time. And this magazine actually did a lot to help form that sense of nationhood that we later only saw for a brief period in the 1920s, but basically didn't see until 1991, until the current sort of period. Here are Jewish girls going to school, and the same 12-year-old Muslim girls, another 12-year-old Muslim girls being married off to kind of an old senile man. Here you have the double standard I was talking about with an Azeri husband with his Azeri wife, but the same man being whipped by his Russian mother. Now, the Azeri alphabet is in fact, that's how we kind of fell in love with this publication. Here we have parliamentarians cutting off Azeri and spelling and sawing on the Russian alphabet. The Azeri, basically Azeri as a language wasn't considered to be a literary language in the early 20th century, so it's quite forward-thinking for Mullah Sudan, quite revolutionary for it to publish in Azeri Turkic, the dialect, considered dialect at the time. What would have been more traditional would be to either publish in Russian or to publish in Istanbul, or sort of official, quote-unquote, Turkish. Again, another kind of great illustration about tongues. If you notice the difference in illustrations from earlier, well, this on the right is an illustration that was done after the Bolsheviks arrived to power. And the magazine, the quality of the magazine declined quite considerably after 1918. The Azeri and language changed alphabets 3 times in 70 years. So, in 1929, basically Lenin believed that the revolution of the East would mean to Latinize all Muslim subjects, the language of all Muslim subjects of the Soviet Union. And the reason why is not just kind of let's say, a prejudice vis-a-vis Muslims. Why would they not Latinize, let's say, Georgian or Armenian? It was mostly because they believed that by separating Muslims from Arabic script, it would somehow sort of cut them off from their heritage, renaming their Muslim heritage, Arabic, the language of the Quran. And Lenin didn't live to see this, but Stalin and others did implement this. In 1929, all Muslim subjects of the Soviet Union the languages were Latinized, and so. If you can imagine, sort of just on a logistic basis, how you do that. Imagine a country the size of Belgium, sort of sending people, one day to the next. You're going to speak the same language, but you're going to do it from right to left and not from left to right, and it's going to be this alphabet. Of course, the true story also is that there was much like quite a small percentage of literacy at that time, but still there's quite a lot of sort of cultural heritage and intellectual heritage that was lost. For example, Islamic natural medicine was quite important in the Caucasus at the time, and in fact, people like Rudolf Steiner and sort of early homeopathists were looking to that region and lost it, and so a lot was lost, and these books were brought out and sort of forced to be burned. Like the Turks, they Latinized in 1929, but unlike the Turks, they continued. So this is Pavilion where in 1939, Stalin believed that Muslims were getting too close to the West, or that there could be a pan-Turkic fear, because Turkey had already Latinized, so they were afraid of this kind of pan-Turkic. All the Muslim peoples of the overwhelming majority, I should say, of the Muslim peoples of the former Soviet Union are Turkic, speaking Turkic language, and the languages linked to Turkish, or related to Turkish. And so So they Cyrillicized everything. So again, starting from scratch, let's Cyrillicize. And then 1991, back to Latin. So what you have in Azerbaijan, right, or you had, at least until recently, you had a situation where 3 generations spoke the same language, but they couldn't read or write the same book. And you can understand sort of what kind of sort of devastation that kind of havoc that wreaks on a culture. I'll give you a kind of an anecdote as well. Remember these books I showed you in the beginning? So Mola Nasruddin was originally written in Arabic, right? Everything was written in Arabic script. It says Mola Nasruddin. And from 1930s, basically the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, about 40 years, they re-Cyrillicized everything. Up until 1988, and then when the Soviet Union fell, and they Latinized the script, they actually never put it out and they had to start from scratch. So about 30 years of work had to start again. And that's just kind of one example of the absurdity of this kind of language alphabet politics. Now, this inspired another one of our works, which is, the famous phrase, a proverb in English, shame on, fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me. Or we continue to say, fool me once, shame on Arabic, fool me twice, shame on Cyrillic, fool me thrice, shame on Latin. And we thought about sort of rebranding Azeri to express our exasperation, trying to translate this language like, Azeri, because you're going crazy trying to find a translator who can read and write 3 different iterations of his or her language. It's easy to find a translator, or relatively easy to find a translator of any given language. In the end, we had to resort to Azeri to Russian, and Russian to English translation. So we translated from the Russian to the English. Here you see all 3 scripts on the same page: the Arabic, the Cyrillic, and the Latin. Next chapter, next sort of section we'll look at is East versus West. Now, the magazine was a product of its time in the sense that, like Ataturk and the reforms in Turkey, believed that the West sort of held certain keys of modernization, technological superiority, educational superiority, gender equality. And it was against superstition, against clericalism, against what it deemed to be the passivity of Muslims sort of in the face of exploitation. So here you have, for example, a traditional heating mechanism called kursi or kursum. And kursi is where you basically put a hearth on the ground and put a blanket. And these are making kind of comeback, at least in Iran. People rediscovering their pre-industrial heritage. And so you heat rooms like this, and you sleep under these kursi where you put your legs underneath, or your arm. Here, the family is sort of wondering how the Russians live without one. Well, the Russians didn't have one because they had heating at the time, so they didn't need a kursi. Or the difference in technology on the right being the glimpse of Europe, and on the left the glimpse being the same Mahmoud Shah, who's been sent off to Ukraine as kind of a glimpse himself. One of my favorite ones also is this illustration of a husband inviting a doctor to see his wife who has a sore throat, and the wife refuses to unveil her face for the doctor, but as soon as a mullah comes in to write a prayer, she has no problem sort of bearing all and going topless. Now, one something I'd like to sort of devote more time to eventually is this movement called Jadidism. Now, Jadidism was a movement of reformists in the former Soviet Union, in the former Russian Empire, led by a man, founded by a man named Gasprinsky. He was a Crimean Tatar. The Jadidists believe they're an interesting case of compromise. We're quite interested in this notion of compromise as a form of radicalism. In fact, the true radicalism is exact finding compromise. And that's why we'll talk about later at the end of the talk this project we've done about Poland and Iran, where we look at Poland as a bookend to communism in '89, and why we look at Poland as opposed to Romania, Czech Republic, or Hungary, or East Germany, is because Poland really maintained the momentum throughout the 80s through this belief in sort of slow, methodical progress, but also through compromise. It was criticized heavily for compromise, sitting at the same table as communists, with round-table discussions. And so the Irish is key. The notion of compromise, in fact, in many cultures, it's interesting how we think of compromise in some places as weakness, but actually it's quite a difficult strength. So the Jahidis are a good example of this because they really believed in reforming Islam from within. They weren't people from the outside. They weren't like the Bolsheviks who believed, of course, in just sort of scorched earth policy. They were all educated in madrasas and maktabs, sort of Muslim schools, and they believed in reforming education. So by very basic practical moves, like, for example, teaching local languages as opposed to teaching Arabic. Nobody spoke Arabic in Azerbaijan, so teaching Arabic at the time was essentially rote learning, or even providing textbooks or blackboards. And the mouthpiece of this Gasprinsky was a man called Tarjaman, sort of translator, and education was really a pet peeve for Nasruddin. So here you have a teacher, instead of taking responsibility of his duties, essentially, his exercises, he's telling his students the first to catch the fly is to be let out of school early. And again, it's kind of point counterpoint. The first day of school in an Armenian school on the left, and first day of school in a Muslim school on the right, sort of sleeping. Now, despite being kind of pro-Western, let's say, I shouldn't say pro-Western, despite seeing modernity necessarily as westernization, it was very anti-colonial Islamic population. So here you have, for example, the Brits with India, the French with Algeria, and the Germans with Zanzibar. And interestingly enough, animals were used quite often as a stand-in for countries. I haven't really been able to find out why animals. I don't know if it has to do with kind of the role of animals in folklore, or sort of Balkan folklore, or even Caucasian folklore. But what's interesting here is, again, you have the lion is England, Germany is tiger, France is Spain, but the bear is not marked. And you could probably guess who the bear is. The bear is Russia. And the reason why the bear is not marked, it shows actually the status of this magazine. The magazine was actually an official publication. It had official decree of the Tsar. It wasn't a sized up or underground publication. So it happened to be quite wily in criticizing Russia. So it never marked Russia. It never marked the bear. But everybody, of course, visually understood who the bear would be. And through this Azeri identity, as I mentioned, the decision to publish in Azeri as opposed to Russian or Turkish was quite important. But it also was key in terms of forming a coherent sense of Azeri identity. I know today, for example, mixing and matching fashion, sort of both couture and H&M is okay, but at the time it wasn't cool at all. And so here, for example, we spoke about a confused Azeri man who was wearing a traditional headgear, but otherwise European sort of vest and trousers, and or an Azeri sort of intellectual who says, on the right, I'm ready to sacrifice my life for my people. What is my life worth? Otherwise, given how sort of oppressed we are. But as soon as they turn their back, he runs off with the European woman, which is equivalent, I guess, to the resentment that, let's say, many black women in America feel, but otherwise, when a black male sort of who succeeds marries a white person, there's a sense of sort of selling out, in a sense. Now, most of you are familiar with the relationship between Azerbaijan and Armenia. I gave this talk in Institute in Paris, and this slide caused one person to leave the building immediately in a huff. Because Nagorno-Karabakh is one of these frozen conflicts. It's claimed by both Azerbaijan and Armenia. Now, the relationship between the two countries remains quite bad and almost immature to a certain extent. But of course, they're closer than we'd like to, or than they'd like to imagine. And a great illustration here shows the devil kind of stirring things up between them. But as soon as he leaves, the Azeri and Armenian are sort of kissing and making peace. But the reason why the magazine used Armenia as a kind of counterpoint or aspirational kind of model for the Azeris is that, I guess, as a diaspora, Armenians are known to be one of the major diasporas, or the first sort of studied diasporas of the Jews and the Greeks. The attachment to the homeland was quite important, and the solidarity amongst the rich and the poor, but also this solidarity in its language. Even today, at the time. For example, today if you go to Baku, many educated Azeris speak Russian to each other. And you rarely find that in Armenia or amongst Armenians. Educated Armenians speak Armenian to each other. Or Azeris, for example, will change name from Fatima to become Fatia, or Ahun becomes Ahundav. Armenians were less likely to kind of Russify their names. And the emphasis on sort of European values at the magazine saw something which was positive. So when I was living in Moscow for several years, I would often get confronted by Azeris who would say, Azerbaijan is overwhelmingly majority Shia country. Probably the only other overwhelmingly majority Shia countries are Iran and Bahrain to that extent. I think Azerbaijan is 95% Shia. And so Azeris would ask me, Payam, you as an Iranian, our brother, why are you supporting Armenia? Why are you supporting a Christian mission and not us? And you should be with us. And this again shows the complexity of current realpolitik, is that we're often given the impression that Iran is this monolithically messianic Islamist country. It's held bent on sort of bringing revolutionary Islam and Shiism across the board, but actually this proves that that's not right, because that's not correct, because behind Armenia is Iran. And the reason why is because behind Azerbaijan is Turkey, and behind Turkey is the US, and behind Iran is Russia. So you have this, the axis of Yerevan, Tehran, Moscow is an equally an oppositional axis to, let's say, Baku, Ankara, Washington. And again, Azeri reading room in the front is empty, Armenian reading room in the back is full. The last chapter I want to talk about quickly. Are we okay with time? You guys okay for another 10 minutes or so? Okay. The last chapter is Iran. Not only because I'm Iranian, but because actually the magazine has arguably its largest impact in Iran. And for several reasons. One is that between 30 and 40% of Iran's population is Azeri ethnically. Again, we're often given the impression that Iran is a kind of homogenous country, but it's an incredibly diverse country. And in fact, what you consider to be Iranians, let's say Persians or Fars, the majority ethnic group, is actually a minority majority. So they're not even a majority in our country. I think Fars are about 45% to 40% of Iran. In addition to Turkmens and Arabs and Kurds and Baluchis and others. So the magazine had about 15,000 copies in its run, and about 13,000 of them were subscriptions, of which I get 10,000 were sent to Iran. And Azerbaijan has also been historically kind of the most progressive region in Iran. I should clarify that Iran has two provinces called Azerbaijan. We have Western Azerbaijan and we have Eastern Azerbaijan. And then there's the independent Azerbaijan, which was the Soviet, formerly Soviet Azerbaijan, just to make things even more complicated. But essentially, it's a quite fluid central identity for Azeris themselves. And the most kind of progressive elements of Iran have come from historically the Northwest. Whether that's because it's closer to Russia or not is I can't say, but it also was very important in the people who led the constitutional revolution in Iran in 1906 to 1910. They were highly influenced by Mullah Nasruddin. In fact, they started the copycat. They did a journal that was a copy of Mullah Nasruddin called Sud Strafir, and it resulted in the first parliament in all of Asia, first elected parliament in all of Asia, which didn't last very long because the British and the Russians viewed this as a menace and helped bring back the Shah, just like happened in 1953 with Mossadegh. Now, despite, it's quite interesting. Imagine you're a magazine, you're editor of a magazine, and you're always taking the piss of your readership. In a sense, Mullah Nasruddin was quite critical of Iran, and it felt that all the evils of Azerbaijan came from Iran: fundamentalism, the corruption of the clerics. And so here, for example, you have the Russian army, and it says the Iranian army doesn't need an enemy because it injures itself in this year of the ritual of Muharram. And here it sort of says, Mullah Nasruddin pointing to the woman saying, this is what we get from Iran with this kind of fundamentalism. And the Iranians made many formal complaints, both when it was to the Tsars and then to the Soviets. The Tsars never paid attention because it wasn't really a priority to them. I mean, they had their own problem in the early 20th century to deal with in the country. But the Soviets definitely didn't pay attention because they wouldn't collude with a loyalist regime that they just thrown out, the equivalent of which they just thrown out in their own country. And here you have the British and the Russians eating up pilau rice in the shape of Iran, and saying, hurry up, asking the Turks to hurry up and join while it's still warm, as Iran sort of looks inside. Now the magazine, despite being officially recognized, was censored sometimes, and the role of censorship is something that I'd like to talk about. Here, in fact, it was even discussed in the magazine itself, so it's quite brave for the magazine to even address the censorship as opposed to just kind of covering up it, really mark it. And it says, in the beginning, writers used to bully the censors, but then after 5 years, the censors were bullying the writers. Power dynamics had changed. The title of this talk is Maulana Sardin, Embrace Your Antithesis. The reason for that is that, as I mentioned with the language issues, because we speak Persian and Russian, we could understand, let's say, 30% of the magazine before we wrote to the translator. And what happened was, after a year into this project, it's about a 2-year project, a year into the project, we realized that we disagreed with a lot of what the magazine says. Now, what I mean by that is that, for example, Tatars doesn't believe in westernization as minority, definitely not the region. We don't believe in this kind of we're not these kind of gung-ho modernists in the sense of and it's easy for us to sit back 100 years later and say, they were wrong, but we also don't believe in sort of this secular rage, we're all, like the French are so obsessed with secularism. We actually believe we could err on the side of the mystical or the irrational sometimes. And so, in fact, the magazine stands contrary to a lot of why we started something like that. And normally, people don't spend 2 years of their life publishing material they disagree with. At least I don't. I don't think that's never the case. So, halfway through, we kind of felt, we had a moment of, do we continue the project? One reason we were also hesitant was because the last thing we wanted was a magazine to play into the hands of kind of your knee-jerk Islamophobes who are just waiting for an example, or another example to say, look, we had the Danish cartoons now, look, the Muslim publication itself is working on it. So it was kind of tricky. It was kind of tricky moment, and another reason why, in fact, another quite interesting element was we had to censor ourselves at some point in the publication because for 2 reasons. One, some of the drawings were so violently anti-Islam that we didn't want to have Molotov cocktails thrown through our windows, and we didn't want to have bodyguards or any kind of nonsense. We didn't want to deal with this. We also just felt that it's not only our personal safety, but we felt that it was a little bit too, it didn't really add much to the discussion. The publication already was critical of Islam. We showed some of these illustrations, like, for example, here you have a man coming back from Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, and after a week he's already looking at a woman, and after a month he can't handle it, he's just too horny, and he goes to ask for a permanent marriage license so that he can sleep with a woman. So again, of course, poking fun at this kind of hypocrisy of, if you've done Hajj, you shouldn't be thinking about sex the week after you come back. That's the last thing you should be thinking about. Another element, tricky element, was the magazine was funded by an Azeri foundation, and it was important for us in the publication to be as widely read as possible, both in Azerbaijan but also Armenia. And the Armenian question posed an issue, not to the foundation, but to Azeri government, that they didn't want to have trouble with the government. And so we kept, as you saw, many of the pro-Armenian illustrations, instead of having a separate chapter that had Azerbaijan, Armenia, and let's say Georgia, we put them all into the Caucasus, and we allowed it to be a little bit, we call it fudging the lines, if you will, but otherwise, otherwise the book wouldn't exist. And these are some of the drawings that did make it, and that's why they haven't been retouched, but again, showing philanthropy Azeri style, where it starts out giving water, and slowly, but so annoyed that he kind of wants to throw the chair at the supplicant. And then philanthropy, Armenian style, is sort of more sustainable. First, sort of starting with one person, one grantee, another grantee, and then sort of growing organically. And so this question of embracing your antithesis is also quite important, I think, in terms of, and we believe it's quite important in general for our practice. So it's really kind of working with material we're uncomfortable with. And this is, I think, how you really, I think true learning actually happens when you're dealing with stuff that you're not comfortable with. And the problem is that increasingly we're only expose the things we agree with. And we were talking about that earlier, sort of preaching to the crowd, or art, talking about art and self-referential. But even politically, I mean, if you're leftist in America, you read The Nation. If you're right-wing, you read The Wall Street Journal. In France, you read Figaro or Libération. Even Google knows what you like, and it pushes content towards you, because it knows whether you will agree with that content or not. So, in fact, it's important that we kind of grapple with those things that we disagree with quite often. Sudan mentioned the last element that we axis of work called hospitality or generosities. Because the book is such an important, because the book is such an important medium for us, it's actually kind of a reversal of what normally we look at, I think, in many artistic practices, where the book is an afterthought or documentation of something that existed. For us, all the other work, the sculptures, the installations, the lectures, are all actually means to bring people back to the book. For us, the book is the work, in fact, not the sculpture, not the objects themselves. The objects are premised to get back to the book. And one of these is this installations, these tapped, which I don't consider this a work because we didn't do anything to it. It's actually vernacular architecture that you find all across Central Asia and Iran. And like Sudan mentioned, it's, you find it at sort of roadside cafes, restaurants, outdoor seating. And in Iran, where there's not a sense of public space since the revolution, it is a place where men and women can, for example, sit together without being married. It's like a shisha, a hookah, which for women is theoretically sort of is looked down upon in Iran. And it becomes kind of a makeshift salon of sorts. But also, it's a different way of seating, right? It's collective seating. So as opposed to kind of, this is my chair in my private space, and please don't invade my private space. This is a seating for 4 or 5 people at once. And I think that it led to this piece, which I think we do call it a piece, because it's in fact a mix between a rahwe, which is the Quran stand, I'm sure you've seen before, and the taht, and it floats. So you can sit on either side; it won't tip over, as you can see here. And what it addresses, I think, inadvertently, we really are not very versed in discursive art. We came relatively late to art at age 30, but what we realize is that we do hear a lot about participation in art discourse. There's a lot of idea about participation, about engagement. More and more musicians are sort of keen on this question of accountability to the public, getting numbers in as many numbers as possible. And there's all this kind of discourse on top. It reminded me almost like a sort of communist party meetings talking about dialectical materialism, and then there's no food. And museums, there's nowhere to sit. So you're talking about participation and being open and belonging. This is a public institution that belongs to you, the people. But actually, you're not made to feel comfortable in anywhere in the space. If you want to sit down, you have to buy a muffin or coffee. Or actually, the only places that are seating is masterpieces. So in front of the Mazda, at the moment there's a bench we can sit. If we want people to kind of consider work really, and the least we do is give them a place to gather. And these, they've shown for us, in our experience, it's proven to be very successful because, again, there's nowhere to occupy in the recent usage of this term, but kind of the original usage of this term. And another, we first kind of stumbled upon this notion of generosity or hospitality in our project called Friendship Nations. this is a project which looks at Poland and Iran and the kind of unlikely common points of history between Poland and Iran from the 17th century all the way to the 21st century Green Movement. And we presented this in Sharjah. Now, if you remember, Sharjah last biennial, the new one is the next edition will be in a couple of weeks. But the last biennial was marred by a scandal. And it was a scandal where basically the work that was right to the left of ours by Mustafa Ben Fodil was censored, and subsequently immediately the director was dismissed, Jack Persentia. And we were sandwiched between this project which was censored and the only Shia mosque in Sharjah. And the project was called Polish Shiite Showbiz. And this is a majority Sunni country. And it opened the exact day that Saudi Arabia and the Emirates sent troops to invade Bahrain, a Shia country. And the project is all about civil disobedience, solidarity, what does Iran have to learn from? So we had all the ingredients to really for the Shia to hit the fan, if you will. And nobody uttered a peep. Nobody sort of said a word, which for us is a sign of success of the project. Because we're not interested in competition. We don't believe in sort of getting people in the head and tell them things. We don't believe even in the fact that there's a kind of dogma, but there's a general understanding that if art is to be critical or political, it must be dour, depressing, violent, and sort of lecturing in a way. And actually, we don't believe that. I mean, if you look at the best cases of political acts, political work in our region, whether it's Iranian cinema like Kiarostami, or whether it's Mullah Nasruddin, there was always sort of through a triangulation, it was never directly addressing the subject matter. And so, in fact, this became our pavilion became known as kind of the kindergarten next to the mosque. So locals really felt comfortable coming in. Sort of we had Baluchi bakers and Afghan construction workers, and we had our rural people as well. But they all felt that the space belonged to them. And I think the reason why is that, first of all, tea was served. There was a place to sit and take a nap. Again, in the biennial, which is under 30 degrees scorching heat, there was nowhere to sit and relax. We didn't think about that. To be honest, we just thought we first started to create seating structures because we weren't used to the long installation period as artists, because we never worked with artists. And we thought it was really tedious to sit around and wait for installation. So we started to create spaces that we wanted to occupy ourselves. So if I'm going to be in a museum, I want to sit down, at least myself. And if I'm going to sit down, it seems to work, other people also want to sit down. So it's kind of that's how it really started. But also, there's really several entries to the work in the sense that I kind of describe it as when you have such a heavily discursive project like we do, you can't expect to tell it through one piece or even one object or one single piece. It's almost like a kind of a souk or a bazaar approach to art. There's kind of something for everybody in the sense that if somebody wants to come and just take a nap and they don't want to engage with the work at all, let's say these banners that somehow talk about this creolization of messages between solidarity and the Iranian Revolution, that's a perfectly legitimate way to engage with the work. You don't have to. If you want to let anything in life, the more you engage with it, the more you'll get out of it. There's no hierarchy. It doesn't look like art in a capital A. There's no spotlight. There's no white walls. And this is one of the objects from this project, which is a book called Mola, which talks about this kind of unlikely, often overlooked leftist origins of the Iranian Revolution through the symbol of wheat, which is this kind of atavistic symbol, both in as a symbol of nourishment, but also not only as a crest, it's the USSR's crest that we put today's Revolutionary Guards. If you look at the bank of Sepah, the Revolutionary Guards Bank in Iran, it also has loops around, just like kind of cut and paste of the USSR's seal. Finally, the recent work of Mullah Nasruddin was we made a ride for the Guangzhou Biennale, and we wanted to kind of also, how do you convey such complex notions of history, progress, anti-modernism to children? We were just talking about that earlier. Is that our favorite audiences are above the age of 16 and under the age of 10, because they don't have an agenda. I mean, all of us in this room, we're still trying to prove ourselves. We're still trying to, either to ourselves or other people that sort of above 16, under 10, but usually don't have them. They usually either haven't started proving themselves or they've already proven themselves. And through the simple gesture of Mola saying backwards, there's something weird for a child to hold an old man's belly as opposed to the back. And normally we hold the back and right from the back. But immediately what happens is the children always ask the parents, why is Mola sitting backwards? And then you have to, again, talk about quite foreign issues in a very simple but true manner. Thank you.
Yeah, of course, I mean, I probably have a few questions relating to this, dealing with history and things, but one thing that I wanted to ask first is, like, why is he sitting backwards?
Because to look at the facts, actually. I think it's kind of the sense of looking at this, I guess like this kind of core gesture, this almost a simple, stupid yet smart way of it makes no sense, but actually if we could walk backwards it would be great, right? There's people as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's also something that children do, like you try to, you walk backwards as a game. You can, do that the best way. So,
we recently were invited to
participate in a group exhibition at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, which is a new direction of Nicolas Bouillon. And the inaugural show is called the Angel History. So of course this Angel History, there was quite a lot of resonance with Mola Nasruddin. And they asked us to propose something. I think the proposal we gave, I think he had a minor heart attack when we read it. What we actually proposed was to officially make the official mascot of the École des Beaux-Arts, Mola Nasruddin. And of course, European schools don't have these mascots like American schools. But you have like the red cats, wild cats, this paraphernalia, sweatshirts, hats, of universities in America. And we thought, well, it would be really nice to actually bring this very kind of neoliberal consumerist approach, but from the other side. So not having the American pop culture, which is sort of dating, but another approach, and also looking at kind of the story, history of the institution. And for us, it made sense because it's got an incredible history, but until recently, it was sort of underperforming. So, any other questions?
When you were talking about these figures or objects, on the one hand it seems like they are like allegories, like constructed signs where you can potentially say, okay, this thing is worn by the Revolutionary Guard, or for that particular reason because this relates to this and that means that. So that's one dimension where all these signs are somehow coded in a historical way. And then there's this other level where it's just pop, straightforward pop, where it's just, as you say, like, okay, you would want to have somebody interact with it on the basis of, okay, you guys backwards, I can touch his belly, and so there's an immediate, that's a stupid word, no, there's some moment of interaction which has very little to do with the reading. And you say, okay, it's hot, I want to lie down. So there's a moment of some kind of direct use value or interaction, and on the other hand, there's a kind of a complex system of allegorical coding and signification. So, for you, how do these two things play into each other? Does it just tip over from one side to the other, or how do you negotiate or navigate these two possible ways of approaching your work?
It's a good question. I mean, I think that first of all, it's not conscious. I would say that neither is conscious in the sense that at least the first very direct functional or kind of direct pop element is something which is just as genuine as the discursive one, in the sense that, not genuine, but sort of, how do I say, it answers a kind of need, our own need first. I think that in many cases you're always your first audience, and that sounds very navel-gazing, and I think I hope that our work is facing the outwards and also facing inwards, but it's first to fulfill the need you have yourself, and that hope or that humor need is something that we have ourselves in the work, in the sense that it must at least entertain us before it entertains anybody else. And I think that the same with the seating, it really was that stupid. And in fact, the Prayway, people were, people called it a magic carpet, and it's a flying carpet. I never thought about it. We never thought about it as a flying carpet. Of course, I understand it has this underneath this blue neon light, like customized cars that sort of Asian Americans put underneath their cars. But it was something as stupid as, how can we make a rattler of holy books on which you could sit? And that was really the need. So I think that it's good. I never thought about it, but I would say that the real challenge is to have, again, go back to this question of becoming splits, is to have both in a work. I think the successful works are those that have both elements. We've had pieces which are either too much pop, our Nations series, which actually, in fact, was criticized actually quite a lot for being too simple. And these are 7 posters that had these sort of lozenges, my favorite one says "Men are from Mormons, women are from Vilnius," and people sort of said, well, this is a one-liner, but there's more. Actually, there's further elements behind this. One being Vilnius and Mormons, for example, the relationship between. I was had a conversation, so I would talk about the relationship between the Baltics and Russia, followers of which was sphere in Russia, or le fric c'est pas si chic, dit le Tajik. It's taking this disco song about the fric c'est chic, this one. And the Tajik is, and it talks about and saying that money is not so chic, and why the Tajik was not just because it rhymes, because a lot of the guest labor or the migrant workforce in Russia is like in, let's say, in America it's Latino, it's a lot of them are Tajik in Russia. So this, I would say, would argue maybe was too much of the pop, and it was too far removed from the discourse. People felt it was too much of a one-liner, and it goes the other way. But I think the challenge is really to kind of straddle both. That's the difficult thing. It's really to bring, again, this current cycle of work, not lost on Mecca and the Prayway and our book, our most recent book, which is called H. It's a book entirely on the phoneme H, which these are all this current cycle of work looks at sort of mysticism, ritually sacred. But what we try to do, again, you never really bring the sacred with humor together. It's really difficult to do because they're almost like oil and water. You just don't want to mix. And I think the challenge for us is to really how to do both. But answer your question. But I never thought about them being in the same kind of dynamic, actually.
Any other questions?
You briefly touched on this idea of transliteration. Because you don't translate one language into another, you just translate one alphabet into another. And for a moment I was thinking, is that a kind of philosophy, or like a philosophy of practice? So as an artist, I do not have to transform, I do not have to translate, I can just kind of transliterate. Like before, people were saying, hey, you appropriate, you take it out of one context, you put it into another, you take a basketball, and you put it into a kind of a water tank, and then you have a Jeff Koons.
Yeah.
That's appropriation, and then you started talking about transliteration, and I would just be curious to hear a bit more about the philosophy of transliteration, changing alphabet or something like that.
It's I think that I think it's definitely not as it's not as shallow as it sounds. Transliteration is true, and I never thought about transliteration as practice beyond the kind of work on language, but it is in some sense, yes, taking sort of proposals that would be more readily subjects that would be more readily found in journalism or even in academia. For me, this particular book is not an art book. More on Academy is not an art book. For me, an art book, and even we talked, Sudan mentioned the question of performance, the question of our lectures are called performance lectures, lecture performances. I'm not even sure why. I don't understand the world's performance about this lecture. For me, it's a lecture. And we're in fact, it's a lecture which is quite often commissioned by university departments, not art departments, but sort of Middle Eastern studies or Eurasian studies. So I think that maybe transliteration could be a form of telling the story otherwise, yeah. And I think that telling the story otherwise, but I guess, could you then compare sort of anthropology and art as just being different alphabets of a similar language? That's increasingly it's looking that way, at least from our point of view. We're increasingly using art as a platform to tell stories that were often told in other media. I don't know if that would be more translation or translation.
Don't you think that when you describe this as having the problem of what is it named or what is it called, but what you do with history would maybe not be possible in another field, if you would re-edit it would have to be different. And then the point where you said at one point we recognize that we're having actually problems with certain parts of the content. Don't you think that the field of contemporary art or whatever it is allows you to make these selections and it then can work in that context?
It sounds disingenuous, but it's true in the sense that first of all, yes, what we do would not have been able to exist in any other field. And I know because I tried to get the book published by I tried to get more mainstream published by other people, not art publishers, especially not what I would call niche art publishers like JRP or News or Bookworks. These are people who, I tried to have a kind of normal generalist obligation, and they all balked at it. And I think this in-betweenness is very important for us. In fact, our region, that's why our region is maybe overlooked, is that it's in between, right? It's not the Middle East, it's not Russia, it's not Asia, everybody's thinking about China, Eastern Europe. The Middle East, it's in between regions. And our work is similarly, there's elements which are journalistic, there's elements which are academic, but it's not academia, it doesn't have the rigor of academia, it has too much subjectivity for journalism, let's say. And so definitely, but it exists only in art, and I say that both with appreciation to our medium, but also a little bit of unease, because for us, because we come from a background outside of art, and art is a platform for us, and we never actually think about the role of the work within art or art history. And the reason why it's almost it sounds insincere to say that, but we're so focused on our subject matter, we don't really care. So that's somebody else's job. If we do care, we actually expect somebody else to do that. That's somebody else, the curator or critic's job is to situate the work within a larger moment of that milieu. It's not our job. We have only a certain amount of time in our heads and our lives, and we like to focus on the subject matter, which is Judaism or singleton. And in fact, it sort of goes back, in the book, for example, a particular example is, secession. institutions often invite artists to do a show, and they require the artist to do a catalog, right? And typically what happens is that we were forced to do a catalog, and us forced, of course, it's an opportunity to do a book. We love doing books, but the dynamics of the catalog is that the artist will normally ask a well-known critic or curator, so I asked you have to do an essay about us. It makes us look good because we're well respected, and we make you look good because we're up and coming. So it's kind of insider trading in the art world, and for us it's kind of colossal waste of time and energy and paper and money. And for us, we refuse to have somebody else write about us in our own book. That would be like, because you're not going to criticize a critic. A critic is not going to really be critical of the work if I invite them. It's not against the whole rule of hospitality. It's that somebody comes to your house and not eating their food or taking it down on the front door. It just doesn't happen. And it's, in a sense, we're kind of traditionalist in that sense. That if somebody wants to provide a critique of the work, they should do so in traditional and in media, in a magazine, in a journal. Nothing to do with us. It should be in a kind of traditional sense. I know it's difficult to do. I know the economies of magazines are such that it doesn't happen so often to have criticism, that kind of criticism. But that's really that's so. Let's go back to your sort of to what degree we're not really conscious of why we do what we do as artists. We're conscious of why we do what we do as people, as citizens, as curious people, but we're not that conscious of yeah.
No, I meant that more the other way around, that you're actually having like a larger potential because you're in the field of art. Like, if, coming back to the topic of the Central Asian Pavilion and kind of like a lot of problems concerning production, concerning dealing with history and dealing with a market that, let's say, artists in Central Asia have to face. I think this is like, a kind of like smart way of dealing with the history, with like a globalized world, with like a need of finding like a space for the position within all that, and still using humor and using serious topics.
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I think that it's a tribute. We were talking about earlier about, for example, institutional critique. We were talking about that, and it's a tribute to art that it can be so open-ended. It's the only medium, at least I know it. It's constantly questioning its own definition of what it is. I was describing, I have to we remind ourselves is that in a relatively short period of time, 5 years ago, we were working on print. Now that we have 10 pages, and our budgets were 200 euros. And in a relatively short amount of time, the scope of work has changed, and the venues have changed. And that's only possible because that would never happen as kind of outsiders. Again, in our world, we can sort of say, oh, this is bad because you're appropriated by the art world, or you're becoming part of the system. For me, this is the kind of discourse that I don't want to be having. For me, the discourse is, again, it's talking to each other instead of talking to each other instead of talking to the outside world. As long as you're able to produce work which is compelling, critical, and happen to be, let's say, in our case, hopefully somewhat entertaining or interactive or participatory, then that's fine. I don't really care, whether the institution, is increasingly sort of part of neoliberal hegemonies, and I find it's sort of seeing the trees and not the forest.
Any more questions?
Maybe because I just did this before, I'm just curious, how did you come up with the name Stars and Tatars?
Well, the group was founded. The reason, I should maybe say why we founded it. I gave the kind of more ideological reasons, but it was also, there's this mix of polemics and poetics, the intimate as well as the polemical issues. For us, it was the end of kind of a Western promise, in a sense that both Kasha and myself had sort of lived in the major cities sort of the capital of London, Paris, and New York, and studied these institutions, and we sort of fulfilled the objectives we were told we should do. There's enough people that we felt there was something missing for us. And for us, that happened to be an area of the world that was relevant. Both we felt was relevant to us, but also underrepresented and under-discussed. And Slavic Tatars was, we like this idea of again, the humor is this, people imagine kind of a horde of people, of Braveheart, on a hilltop sort of coming to raid and pillage. That's the first impression people, at least in this part of the world, get when they think of Slavs and Tatars. I think of kind of people coming to take our jobs and our young daughters and things. But so we wanted to play in that misconception. But also it's funny that a name, that would be a name, I guess, to a child. The name is a brief. And I should have mentioned this, but we in no way do we position ourselves as experts in the region. That would be, not only would it be ridiculous, because our region is so large that it encompasses I don't know how many ethnicities and languages, but we were no longer, it was agreed to ourselves to study the state of the world, let's say the rest of our lives for the next 40 years. So I think that's part of this, at least, again, to go back to the question of the kind of the approachability or the kind of the functional kind of the use of it is, I hope that people that comes across that it's not pedagogical even in the sense of me sitting there saying, this is what I know and we don't know. It's actually taking people along the ride. It's a we're discovering something and we're happy for people to accompany us in this discovery. But we're not in any way authorities on the subject matter. Neither no one is within, sympathies in Central Asia. There's all of our sources are very well cited. We look to people who know much more about these things, older, more, people.
No, it's kind of a continuation, I guess. But I was wondering if the group is defined, or if you're more like a depot for other Central Asians, I don't know, if you're more like an orchestra where the violin stays, but the violinist changes with time, and you have other people coming into the group, or if it's stationary.
This is unfortunately it's defined, but I should say that and I don't say it's just a kind of sort of post-facto justification, but the question of collaboration is an important one. We're often asked to collaborate, and I think when you collaborate already every day with somebody, like I do, you don't really want to collaborate. It's first of all, you don't really want to collaborate more, but it's enough. But also, I think the collaboration is, we fetishize this term, and I think that we collaborate all the time. And I think that, for example, we really do believe that the curators that we work with, the writers that write about us, that teach us things that we know about our own work, the researchers, the producers, those really are our collaborators. And yeah, I mean, I do believe, it's something that I've been discussing with Kasha recently, is that how can we make it more open source kind of code? Because ideally we both believe in that, but every time we try to incorporate other people sort of into the core, it doesn't work. And sort of, you're always the one that's sort of 2 in the morning doing all the work, and you're sort of wondering, you're the one doing all the work, and so it's sort of, it works that way. Thank you very much.
Thank you.